So now we're going to start setting up some control objects so that we can control pieces of this and see how the deformations are working. I'm going to use one of my scripted tools that's set up and available from download on my site, which gives you some different control objects predefined. There are spline objects like we've used in the past, and we can use those to create some interesting shapes. So I'm going to use the circle arrow control, which gives me this control object here. I'm just going to turn off the display render mesh, and I have sort of a circle with 4 arrows around it. We're going to start off in the corner of the mouth. I'm going to align it up just in position here, and then with angle snap turned on. There we go, angle snap turned on to 90, so it's aligned up to it, and turn off angle snap and just get it basically aligned to how I want the face to sort of deform naturally side to side at that point. So sort of in line with the surface of the mesh, and this will provide us with a control now that handles essentially moving the corner of this mouth on all 3 axes, so we can pull and stretch it however we like to be able to get some of the form out of it. Now, one of the things we're probably going to want to do as well with this control is have it also drive a bit more. This is that sort of the going to be the top layer control, so it's going to drive multiple joints. Eventually, we're going to have a control on every single joint as our secondary control layer, so it's a finite control layer. This layer is going to have some sort of global influence on the deformation. So what I'll do with this one is when this one moves, this joint will move 100%, and then the ones surrounding it will all get pulled on varying degrees, so that when you move this, it kind of helps shift and pull everything out a little bit and pull it all around a little bit. And then we could go ahead and tweak the shapes that we get with that with the tweak layer below it. So now to set this up, one of the things you need to do is we need to get a sort of a true 0 value out of everything here. And the best way to do that is make sure that everything is parented to some sort of point helper or helper object that is aligned up in the orientation that you want. So again, what I'm going to use is my M group tool, and I'll just open the UI portion of it here. And I want to say group all objects in this case, and say group, and it'll take these 2 objects here and parent them to a point helper. I'm going to increase the size of that point helper a bit to say 0.5. And then what I need to do with this, I need to align it up to this control. Now, right now, if I align it to it, it's going to rotate those other 2 point helpers. So I'm going to need to go into the Don't Affect Children in the hierarchy panel and use the Align tool. Don't want it done in position, only want it done in rotation, and so that it's aligned up to it. I also want to make sure that this has got a same sort of point helper aligned to it, so that I know things have their parent objects are aligned up the way they're supposed to. And it helps with all kinds of things. It's going to help with the rotational math. It's going to help with gibble locking possibilities and whatnot that might happen. So same thing here. I'm just going to make the point size 0.5 and group each object and hide. There we go. Show. So sorry, I accidentally hit hide point helpers. The hide point helpers, by the way, in here basically just goes in, turns these off. The show shows them back on again. So now that I've got parent for this, and I have these all are children of this now controls that joint area. The easiest way really to connect this up and have this control be handled by this control would be to just parent it into it. At that point, it doesn't quite work very well with rotations. I want this object out here for its rotations just so it feels a little more natural out from the head, and I want to be able to spin it right where it is. So really what I need to do is I need to connect this to this in some other fashion other than direct parenting, or else it'll rotate around it sort of wildly, not the way I want. I'll just demonstrate that. So if I parent it up to it and I rotate it, it's moving it as well as rotating it. It's not really what I want. Now I could move this pivot of this object back here, and it doesn't quite feel quite as nice. It myself. So I'd rather have this so it stays out from the face with a pivot out here, and then controls it right where it is. So just unlink that now. And what you really need now is this object needs to be parented to something. It needs to be parented back into the rig as well. And it really probably should be parented up to the jawbone. The problem here is, again, as soon as I do that, this object, or even as it's sitting in world space, really doesn't have a parent that's aligned to it. So its orientation is not aligned to its parent, and you want that with rotations all the time, orientations of objects, so that you get a true zero value, and you're not already forcing an object into a gimbal situation, or partway into a gimbal situation as you start working with it. So we're going to group this. And I say group, I mean my mgroup option. So we're going to parent it up to a node as well. So I'm going to say group each object, and let's just take the size down a little bit and put it in 1. Now something you'll notice that my mgroup tool does is it parents the node to it, aligns the node to it, the helper to it, and then parents the one you had selected to it, but it also keeps the hierarchy intact, so it actually now is still parented up to the bone. The ungroup will actually remove it out of the hierarchy and leave the hierarchy intact, which is very handy. So now what we can do is we can go about connecting this to this with wire parameters so that it actually is controlled by it directly. Now the way we're going to deal with that is, first off, we're going to go and grab my pen rigging utils script that I use all the time for setting 0 positions and 0 rotations. It's very much the same as using the freeze transform tool that's built in. I tend to use this one more because it's one that I've written and has more controls for handling, adding certain controllers and dealing with their naming conventions and renaming list controllers and deleting and making active list controllers by name. So it's a handy tool to get used to using. So what I'm going to do is just say 0 position, 0 rotation, and what it's done is it's gone and set up list controllers now on the actual objects. So let me just go into the track view. I have a track view set up here that doesn't have the curve editor showing. It's just the side with all the controllers and all the tracks, so that I can just manage my my controllers and whatnot. So now you can see that it's actually set up to 0 and animation tracks. 0 being basically the base value, the starting value, and then the zeroed out tracks. Now what I'm going to do is, with this one here, I'm going to take this one here and just change the controller types that are in here. Assign controller, and I want to make it a Bezier position, and this will just save some time in setting things up. And assign controller in the rotation and make it TCB rotation right at the bottom. What you can do now is you can actually connect these. So I'm going to go and connect the Bezier position to the position, the animation position. Now I can't choose this track, and I have to have that track because the Bezier position that I'm using is actually an XYZ value. I can't just pick X, Y, or Z. But since I can't pick this in the wire parameter, you just pick X anyways, or Y or Z. And then here's that showing up. You can now just go back one and choose the parent track of it, and that holds the full XYZ value. So now when I connect it, I've connected it directly to all X, Y, and Z. It just saves on having multiple controllers handling it all. So now it's now it all functions as you'd sort of expect. So now what you can do is do the same thing with the rotation of it. I'll just leave this open. TCB, and there's the animation on the rotation, but instead of picking X, Y, Z, you pick the parent track, and that again is a quaternion value. So now when we rotate it, it rotates in its spot as well. So believe it or not, the actual parent track of an XYZ and Euler controller at max is actually returning a quaternion value, and not the Euler XYZ value. So that confuses some people when they get to that stage and can't understand why it's not returning that XYZ value. To get at the Eulers individually, to get at the Euler values, you have to get at them individually. It's the only way to do it. So now you have this control that's set up that allows you to move and pull on the corner of that mouth. Of course, this control as well, the parent of it should also be parented up to the jawbone, so that when we rotate the jawbone, it's still pulling the corner of that mouth down, and the control moves with the corner of the mouth, and then we can easily just control the corner of the mouth and set it. Be able to move it around. We'll be able to move it around in all 3 axes, as well as rotate it at any point in time to twist it, because you can see that it's actually twisting the joints a little bit, and that'll help get some different facial expressions that we might need. So now what we're going to do is we're going to hook up the rest of the joints around the corner of the mouth, so that when we move the corner of the mouth here, the others move a little bit and react a little bit to it and push themselves. So we're going to do exactly the same sort of setup that we did with this one. Group all objects. I'm going to say group. Drops a group node in there. I'm going to align it in orientation only to the control. Now I don't want to leave it in that direct orientation, because what's going to happen is when I move this completely directly sideways along the negative x, this one will move directly along the negative x, and you can see that it's actually going to pull the face straight out. What we want this to actually do is to rotate a little bit with the face, and sort of like it's curving around the face. So I want to align that more sort of the normals of the face in a sense, directly out from the side. Now when it moves along the X, it's kind of pushing it along this joint, down this joint a bit more. We could adjust this as we see fit to get the kind of effect that we're looking for, so that it could eventually do down the side if we wanted. So we'll have to go back and play with that a little bit, get it exactly the way we want. I'll just leave it somewhere in the middle then for now and see how that works, and see if that's going to do what I want it to do. So now that it's set up there, I think I'm just going to do a couple undos there just to make sure. I think I'd rotated it with Don't Affect Children turned off, and in that it changed the orientation of my joints initially, because it had rotated these point helpers. They're parented to it, so I want to make sure I don't do that. I don't want to affect the initial setup of the joints at all. I never want to affect them. It's there exactly where I want them to be. So now that I've got that set up, I can go in and zero this out, and then you can parent it up to the joint. What I'm doing in doing this is actually creating a problem. I zeroed this with the list controllers on it. They put these list controllers. I then parented this to this joint. Well, my tool here, when it's set up, it automatically makes the second controller active. Now, when I initially placed the list controllers on the object and made the second one active, the second one was 0. But as soon as I parent it to this new node, it is no longer parented to world space, and that 0 value disappears. So no longer is the value of the XYZ here actually 0 anymore. If we go along to the motion panel, we can see that X is negative 16, 129, 77 is the actual, and that's the rotation isn't 0, and then the position is 11, 10, and negative 82. So it's actually moved it as soon as I parented it to it. So we need to re-zero it now that it's been parented. The best thing to do when you're using the list controllers, if you're going to be parenting or trying to move around that value, we don't want to affect the 0 value of the second controller, is make sure that the object is actually set to have the first controller active all the time. If I now parent or unparent it, it's the first controller that's going to get the value change, not the one that's not the second one, the one that we want to remain at 0. So it's a great way of doing setup. Also, it's a great way of setting up reusable rigs that you can repurpose and resize without affecting 0 values. So now that we've done that, I'm going to make both of them active. The first one's active, and I've got that again in this window here, set active, set first, and it'll set all the controllers, list controllers, active on the first in the transform properties anyways. So now that I've done that, I can go about connecting these up. I'm going to change up a little bit how I do the wiring again, because I didn't bother putting the Bezier controller on here, but that's done exactly the same way that we did it the first time on this side. So again, I'm just going to go X to X, but now I'm going to say animation to animation. And it'll replace this controller with a Bezier controller, XYZ controller, basically a wire parameter that'll handle all X, Y, and Z. So now that I've connected it up, you can see that I'm getting a one-to-one relationship on the control. But again, like I said, without the parent node underneath here, you can see now when I push it sideways, it's not going in the direction of the X that we'd expect. It's because it isn't a true zeroed out value. It's not truly zeroed out in rotation. It is currently taking on its parent's axis orientation. So you can see that that's the direction that X is being pushed. So we have to actually make sure that we always parent this up to a node that is aligned to it, orientationally aligned to it. Now what we're going to do is we'll go back here, say group each object, and we'll drop that in there. And now you can see if I go back down, this is the actual one that is, its parent now is aligned to it. So now when I move this control, it's moving in the direction that we expect. It's because it's moving around that parent's axis. So if you have to adjust the actual orientation of this, the way that it's going to push this joint, we have to change this root one, this parent one here, the one that's at the top of the hierarchy of these point helpers. And that will affect the direction that this one moves. You can see that this object's parent is the actual jawbone again. It doesn't matter though, it's this one that's having been wired, and it's this one that's going to be affected by how that orientation is being affected. So you can see there's, if you get that error happening, that's where it's coming from. So now you can see that I can push this and it's pushing that joint in the direction we expect it to. However, it is going one-to-one. What we might want to do is we might want to multiply it by something. So times 0.7 or something. Try that. So it doesn't move quite as much, or we could say 0.6, and now we can play with the amount that's actually going to be moving with it. And so we're getting a little bit of a compression on the corner of the mouth here, which is what we're looking for. So we can find that right value. Now the rotations, while we're here, we can do those as well. We're going to connect up the rotation, the animation, to this one. This is going to become a quaternion again. And unfortunately, you can't just multiply a quaternion by 0.5 and get the half of the rotation. You actually have to use a slurp algorithm to do it. That can be looked up in the help, but it's easy. It's slurp. And then what you want to give it is you need to give it actually two quaternion values. In this case, its starting value and its end value. And then you need to give it a third value, which is a float value from 0 to 1, which is the interpolation value. 0 would give you all of 1. 1 would give you all of the other quaternion that you're passing it. So the first quaternion is going to be essentially the identity quaternion. So an unrotated quaternion, which is the initial starting point of this object, because it's parented up to something that's aligned to it. Its initial quaternion value would be a standard identity quaternion. So you write a quaternion by quat 0 space 0 space 0 space 1 and bracket. And that is a quaternion value that has not been rotated at all. Then you pass it the quaternion value that we're passing into the expression, and that's the one that's coming from our control object. And then you pass it the amount of interpolation between the two quaternions value from 0 to 1. So 0.5 would be somewhere in between. So now when we rotate this, we're actually getting half of the rotation here at this end. If we say 0.1, we'll get very little rotation at this new point helper. And of course, if we set all the way to 1, we'll get 100% of the rotation. So a 1 represents all of the track that we're inputting from the control. A 0 would return all of the identity quaternion and get us nothing at all. And then somewhere in between. So let's do 0.5 right now and try that and see if it's the kind of rotation that we want out of it. Maybe we want a little bit less of the rotation on it, go down to a 0.3, and we can play with those and see what kind of values that we're going to get from it that we want. So now you can actually multiply quaternions. The reason I'm not doing it with the Euler XYZs is every single time I wanted to try and adjust this, I'd have to open up each X, Y, and Z wire parameter and go that route. And that just becomes more and more difficult and not very easy to deal with. So now it's very quick and simple because it's just one expression handling the rotation, one expression handling the position of it, and I can multiply it. Now if I wanted to break it into individual axes and actually control each axis of rotation a little bit separately to really finally control this, I would have to go down to an Euler, and it would be easiest to go to a position XYZ, although we could actually in the position break this into X, Y, and Z and multiply each one separately. In the quaternion, you can't do that the same way. So you may as well just go to the Euler at that point and deal with it that way. But I don't think we need to go to that kind of refinement for this to get that kind of control. Because we're going to have the second layer of controls, that refinement control, we're going to have a control on each one of these. We'll be able to control that anyways. So now it's a matter of doing it to each of the joints the way you want, going through the same process. What I'm going to do is say group all and drop in that new group. I'm just going to go to don't affect children, align it in orientation, and then again the same thing here. I want to go and actually make sure that it is lined up in the direction that I want to push it. In this case, I want to push it up a little bit. I want them to push up along the length of the bones and somewhere in the middle of the joint rotations, let's say, for now. Same thing, I'm going to go and say group each object now, and then just make sure that this is parented up to the top node. I want to do it right up to the top here so it doesn't rotate with the joint up and down the jawbone. And now with this, again, I can go to the previous one. Oops, looks like I didn't actually group it. Oops. Well, let's go back and do that again. I'll line that back up again the way it's supposed to be. Align. And I'll just go through it again. Looks like I didn't group it correctly. And so it's lined up the way that I want. We'll say group each object, group, and just make sure that's oh, there's the new one. Okay. Parent this up to the top node up here. And then I just need to go in and zero this out. 0. And I'm going to make sure that the first one is active in case I do any changes to it and want to move it around or anything, and I don't affect my 0 values. Same thing again, I'm just going to go through the wiring process, wire the position to the position, and I think I want to reduce the movement on this one a fair bit, 0.3 maybe. And same thing on the rotation. And again, I want to throw in a slurp function and the identity quat, and put in a very low value again, I think, for the rotation, something quite low. So now I should have the same sort of reaction going on here. And you can see that it's actually pulling it down and around. So when I pull it down, straight down, it's actually not going straight down. It's actually following some of the curves around the mouth, which is kind of nice. When I push it straight out, it's actually not just going straight out, it's actually going up and over the curve of the face, as these muscles would be pulling along this line here. So it actually allows you to pull it along the line. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to go set it up for the other joints around the area, and then we'll take a look at how that's reacting to the rest of the face. So I've done some more setup here and got the rest of the side of the face working with this one control. You can see that now we're getting a very nice fluid motion around the whole face. As I pull it out, you can see that it's stretching all the way down underneath the jowls, up the side of the face, up and over the cheek area. It's also pulling the sides of the mouth either to the sides here as well. And it's doing a nice flexing part of it. I didn't bother with the rotation on most of them. It's probably not going to get used an enormous amount. The rotation just affects the very nearest joints that it might need to work with, and then the rest is just position. I readjusted a couple of things too. I reoriented some of these controls so they're pointing in a bit better position down the bones, and I really want to adjust this one a bit more. I want it to go up this angle a bit better, and the way to do that is to actually select not just this one. If you rotate this one, it won't have an effect on the direction it goes, because it's the parent, it's the offset from the parent that's causing a problem there. So what we're going to do is select both. You really only need to actually rotate the parent, but it would look kind of strange and wouldn't make a whole lot of sense. And again, make sure you turn on affect children, don't affect children, and then rotate it to the direction you want, and you can adjust just how it pulls the face and in what angles it pulls the face on, so you can actually get it to go and sort of tweak the direction that you like. So that's working pretty good. I'm getting a pretty nice flex out to the side, nice pull, and a nice pull when I go out on the Z. You can actually sort of round the face out in that area, pull the corner of the mouth out. Now again, you might want to go in and adjust values for all X, Y, and Z axes so that pulling out doesn't affect this as much as pushing it back, things of that nature. But that's a real refined thing, and it's just whatever you happen to need, and obviously how much time do you have to sit and play with it. So you can always go further. Of course, there is always multiple solutions to the same problem, part of the beauty of it all. The next thing I want to do is I want to tack another control back here, and that's going to affect kind of this area, and then I might even put one up on the cheek to sort of affect the cheek area more as a sort of as a top control. I'm also going to put one top and bottom lip that's going to pull on the top and bottom a fair bit, and so there's going to be several new ones going to be added in. Now, part of the trick of this is that I'm just going to copy this control, and I'm just going to do a quick align to here, I guess, and move it out and find a good spot for this. So this is going to be the cheek one. It's going to handle it over here. Now, part of the issue with this one is, looks like a good angle to put it on about there, maybe. Part of the problem with this one is if I connect this control up to this joint here up to this control, and then just parent this control into the system the way I have, which is just down to the jawbone. When I move this control, I'm going to be leaving this behind, and it's not going to rotate with it. And that may not be what we want again. We want this to actually move with it. A couple of different ways we can do it. One interesting way I've found to do this sort of thing is to actually completely cheat and create, for all intents and purposes, somewhat of a circular dependency going. What I'm going to do is I want to parent this control right back into the point helper that moves when I move this. So now what happens is that control automatically moves with the face. Now the problem is I have to get this to move with this, so circular dependency. What's great about list controllers is we can layer up things and get them to work the way we want. Now this should also be aligned to this because it's going to run in that direction anyways for that joint. And it looks like because it's parent into, it's going to flip it over and whatnot right now. I don't know quite why, but there we go. Orientation-wise. And so now what we can do is, again, just go back and parent it back into it. So now what can happen is when I pull on this, it's going to affect this joint and probably a couple around it again. It won't affect the corner of the mouth, though it'll pull this one and probably move this one and this one and this one a little bit to get them just to pull and stretch nicely with it. So now what I'm going to do is on this joint here, go back to my list controllers, you can see that the available track that's open in the list controller. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a wire parameter again in the position, this time to the available track, and then down to the XYZ, and then back again to the XY, the actual position XYZ controller, to the available track. And if I use the available track and say connect, what it does, it hooks a wire parameter in there. So now I've got 100% control here. So I'm getting the solution where this is controlling that joint, this control is moving with that joint, and then this joint is moving that joint. But if you notice, part of the problem here is this control is moving twice as fast as the joint. That's because not only does it move the joint moves it back through its parent node. So we've got sort of a circular dependency there, so we're getting this double transform happening on the control. You can see it's moving twice as fast. Well, a great way to solve that is, again, an interesting little cheat. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go in and I'm going to say wire the available track of the position of this object back to the animation track of it. And I'm going to say times -1. So I'm actually wired it back to itself. So essentially this track is being controlled by this track right above it. So now when I move it, it doesn't move twice as fast because this track is moving it back. So you're actually getting animation in this track here. It's actually going to have function curves. It won't be sitting flat. It'll be the exact opposite of the animation on this track. So you've got this nice sort of loop back around, and it doesn't slow things down too much. It shouldn't be bad for a facial setup, I wouldn't think. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in and set up some of the same things I've done for these joints back to this control. I'm going to add a list controller here and put them back into this control, so that I'm getting exactly the same sorts of solutions that I was here. So now what I need to do is exactly the same thing. Because the list controllers are all set up, I can say available to the animation track, and I can say, you know, times 0.3 or something, and you get this nice flexing going on. And same thing down here. Available back to here. And let's say the animation track and times 0.3. And maybe that one should be even a lot less, just a touch, maybe even a 0.1 or 0.15 or something. Just a little bit of motion in it maybe or something. And then of course this one back here should do the same thing. And times 0.3, let's try that as well. And now you've actually got this nice double controls that are going on here, so you can control the cheek area with this, and you can control the whole corner of the mouth and into the face with this. So you can place this where you want and then actually ride on top of it again with this one and adjust it a bit more. And then essentially we're going to have the bottom layer is going to be control over each individual joint, so you can get whatever you want out of it. So you can see you can really start to tweak the face just with a couple of controls here and start getting some nice feels to it. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to stick a cheek control up here and have the same sort of thing. I have a couple of these affected, maybe even the joints underneath the eye affected, so when I move this one, it moves several of the joints up around here around the cheek. And then of course I'm also going to set up the mouth here too, the top and the bottom of the mouth with the exact same sort of setup. These will be set up just like this control is, because they'll be complete top level controls. And the cheek here too, I think it'll be probably just a control like this, not like this one. Maybe I'll put it on this joint here or something, have it follow that joint there. might be worthwhile, so that I can move that one around and have this whole cheek area move. That might work nicely, actually. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to finish setting up this, and then I'm going to discuss how to mirror everything over and get all these angles, because the rotations of each of these need to be the same on the other side. So I'm going to show you a quick little scripted method for mirroring quaternion values, which you'll find very useful.